Asterisk asterisk 3 Disturbing True Highway Horror Stories. V2 asterisk asterisk. Picture this. It's late at night, the kind of dark that swallows everything whole, where even the stars feel too far away to help. You're driving down a desolate highway, headlights carving a lonely path through the night. The road stretches endlessly before you, flanked by shadowy trees and the occasional flicker of a passing mile marker. It's the perfect recipe for quiet introspection or for something to go horribly wrong. Tonight, we're diving into 3 disturbing, true highway horror stories that will make you think twice before taking those long, lonely drives. These aren't just tales of broken-down cars or wrong turns. These are the stories of real people who ventured onto the open road and found themselves in situations that defy explanation or logic. Our first story begins with Katie, a college student heading home for the holidays. She'd left campus later than planned, hoping to beat the weekend traffic by traveling at night. Her playlist kept her company as the clock inched closer to midnight. The highway was eerily empty, and with every passing minute, the sense of isolation grew stronger. Then, just as she reached the stretch of highway locals referred to as the Ridge, her car radio began to crackle. It wasn't just static, it sounded like faint whispers, overlapping and growing louder. She turned the radio off, but the whispers didn't stop. Meanwhile, across the country, another driver was having his own brush with the inexplicable. Marcus, a long-haul trucker with over 15 years of experience, was used to the strange quirks of the open road. He had a treasure trove of stories, encounters with wildlife, odd hitchhikers, and the occasional eerie coincidence. But nothing prepared him for what he saw that one foggy night on Route 62. A figure appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the road. Slamming on the brakes, Marcus barely stopped in time, but when he stepped out to check, there was no one there. What he discovered instead was much, much worse. Finally, there's Emily and Ben, a young couple on a cross-country road trip. They were taking the scenic route, documenting their adventure for their... Katie slowed down, heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't make out any details. The figures were shadowy, almost translucent, but they were definitely there. She debated whether to pull over, but something about them didn't feel right. Her instincts screamed at her to keep driving, so she did, her eyes flicking nervously between the figures and the road ahead. As her car passed, the figures didn't move, didn't turn toward her. But for a split second, she swore she saw one of them raise a hand, like they were reaching for her. Miles away, Marcus lit a cigarette, the glow from his dashboard flickering against the dark interior of his truck. He was still rattled from what he'd seen, or hadn't seen, on Route 62. The figure that had appeared in front of his truck had been so sudden, so real. He could still hear the screech of his brakes and feel the thud of his heart as he stepped out, expecting the worst. But there had been nothing. No body, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. He'd searched the area with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke. The silence out there had been unnerving, like the world was holding its breath. And then he found it. Not a person, but an old, tattered backpack lying just off the road. It looked like it had been there for years, weathered and torn. But when he picked it up, something inside felt heavy, solid. Curiosity got the better of him, and he unzipped it. Inside was a single object, a rusted, old-fashioned key attached to a leather tag with the number 13 carved into it. It wasn't much, but it sent a shiver down his spine. Marcus wasn't a superstitious man, but something about the key felt wrong, like it didn't belong there or anywhere. He threw it back into the truck, figuring he'd deal with it later. Maybe it was part of someone's lost luggage. Maybe it was nothing, but deep down he knew it wasn't nothing. Meanwhile, Emily and Ben were still parked in the middle of that strange, deserted road. They'd been staring at the rusted car for what felt like an eternity, neither of them sure what to do. Its headlights cast long, eerie shadows through the surrounding trees, but there was no sign of movement. "Do you think someone's hurt?" Emily whispered. Ben shook his head, his jaw tightening. I don't know. They didn't move. They didn't say anything. They just stared at me. Emily's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind them was empty, but the unease in her chest wouldn't go away. Katie, Marcus, Emily, and Ben, all of them on different roads, in different parts of the country. Yet, their experiences carried the same undercurrent of something unnatural, something that couldn't be easily explained. And as the night wore on, each of them would come to realize that their encounters were far from over. Katie's pulse was racing as she sped down the highway. She kept glancing in her mirrors, half expecting to see the figures reappear. But the road behind her was empty, swallowed by the night. She tried to shake the image from her mind, those shadowy forms, that hand reaching out, but it clung to her like the humid air in the car. She rolled the window down, hoping the rush of cool wind would calm her nerves. It didn't. The whispers had stopped, but now the silence felt just as oppressive. Just as she began to think she might be in the clear, her headlights caught something on the shoulder up ahead. Her chest tightened. Another figure. This time, it was unmistakably a person, a man, standing motionless by the guardrail, facing away from her car. Katie slowed instinctively, but she didn't stop. Something in her gut told her to keep going. As she passed, she risked a quick glance at him. His clothes looked strange, old-fashioned, like they were from another era. And then, as her car drew parallel to him, he turned his head. Katie's stomach flipped. The man's face was pale and expressionless. Ben leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Maybe the signal came back. Let's just follow it and get back to the main road. Reluctantly, Emily followed the new directions, but as the minutes passed, the road seemed to grow narrower and more isolated, the trees pressing closer with every turn. The GPS chimed again, but this time the voice sounded off, distorted, almost like it was underwater. Emily's stomach churned. What's wrong with it now? She muttered, glancing at the screen. The route had changed again, but instead of street names or distances, the display was filled with a string of strange, nonsensical symbols. And then the voice came back, whispering something unintelligible. Emily slammed the brakes, her breath hitching as she stared at the screen. This can't be real, she whispered. Ben leaned closer, his face pale. Turn it off. Just turn it off. Emily jabbed at the power button, but the screen didn't respond. The symbols continued to flash faster and faster until the GPS abruptly shut itself off. In the sudden silence, they both heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere outside the car. All three roads, Katie's, Marcus's, Emily, and Ben's, seemed to be converging on a strange and inexplicable darkness. The open highway, once a symbol of freedom and escape, was now a labyrinth of fear, pulling them deeper into its grasp. And no matter how fast they drove, no matter how far they tried to run, the road was always one step ahead. Katie's hands were numbed from clutching the steering wheel, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. The man on the side of the road had been unlike anything she'd ever seen, and the further she drove, the less the distance seemed to calm her. She kept glancing at the dashboard clock, which hadn't changed in what felt like hours. She thought it was broken, but then her phone buzzed on the seat next to her. As they drove, the trees seemed to close in tighter, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead. The shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering in the corners of their vision. Emily's knuckles turned white as she gripped the wheel, and Ben kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to appear in the back seat. "Do you hear that?" Ben asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Emily shook her head, her heart pounding. "Hear what?" Ben leaned closer to the window, his face pale. "It sounds like footsteps, like someone's running alongside us." Emily's stomach dropped. She couldn't hear anything over the hum of the engine, but Ben's fear was contagious. She pressed harder on the gas, the car picking up speed. The road twisted and turned, the headlights barely keeping up with the sharp curves. Then, without warning, something darted across the road. Emily screamed, swerving to avoid it. The car skidded, tires screeching as they fought for traction. The vehicle came to a stop, the headlights illuminating a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the same rusted car from before, the same one they had left miles back. Its headlights were still on, casting long, distorted shadows. "How is that possible?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling. Emily didn't answer. Her breathing was ragged, her chest tight as she stared at the impossible scene in front of them. Back on her endless highway, Katie was still driving, but the lines on the road had disappeared. The asphalt looked warped, like it had been melted and then frozen in time. Her car's headlights flickered, threatening to go out entirely, and the whispers had returned, louder and more insistent. This time, they weren't just noise. They were words. "Turn back," they hissed. "Turn back before it's too late." Katie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The road offered no answers, only more darkness. The whispering grew louder, filling her ears, her head, her entire body. She screamed, slamming the brakes and skidding to a halt. The car idled, the engine sputtering like it might die at any moment. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the beam of her headlights. It was the man from earlier, the one with the empty eyes and the old-fashioned. Meanwhile, Marcus's truck refused to start. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the key tightly in his hand, unwilling to let it out of his sight. The tapping on the passenger window had stopped, but now the entire truck seemed to creak and groan, as if something heavy was pressing down on it. "Come on," he muttered, turning the key in the ignition again. The engine sputtered and wheezed, but didn't catch. Suddenly, the truck's interior lights flickered on, and the radio crackled back to life. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The haunting music from earlier returned, slower and more distorted this time, like a record playing at the wrong speed. Then, over the eerie melody, a voice whispered his name. "Marcus." His blood ran cold. He turned toward the passenger seat, where the key had been, but it was gone. The leather tag with the number 13 now lay on the dashboard, the key itself nowhere to be seen. "Marcus," the voice repeated, louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows outside the truck grew darker, pressing against the windows like liquid night. "Who's there?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking. The only response was a low, guttural laugh, echoing in the small space like a predator playing with its prey. He didn't wait to hear more. Throwing open the driver's side door, Marcus jumped out, his flashlight slicing through the thick fog. But the moment his boots hit the ground, the light flickered and died, plunging him into total darkness. Emily and Ben's car came to a screeching halt as they confronted the impossible sight in front of them. The rusted car, identical to the one they'd left behind miles ago, still sitting in the middle of the road. The headlights flickered as if struggling to stay on, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance around the vehicle. "This isn't real," Emily whispered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This can't be real." Ben didn't respond. He was staring at the car with wide eyes, his breath shallow and rapid. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he reached for the door handle. "Ben, what are you doing?" Emily hissed, her voice. Marcus stumbled into the same clearing from another direction, his flashlight long since dead. The oppressive darkness had become a physical weight, pressing down on him as he moved. When he saw the ruined structure, his breath caught. He didn't know how he'd ended up here or why, but the sight of the number 13 sent a chill through him. Katie spotted him first. "You," she cried, her voice trembling. "Where did you come from?" Marcus turned toward her, equally startled. "I don't know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was driving, and I don't even know what this place is." They stared at each other for a long moment, their shared confusion and fear creating an unspoken bond. But before they could say more, a third figure stumbled out of the fog. It was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Ben's gone," she whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it real. "I don't know where he went." The car disappeared. Everything disappeared. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of their individual experiences sinking in. They had all been drawn here, to this impossible place, and none of them knew why. Before they could question each other further, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more distinct, and they weren't coming from the shadows. They were coming from the structure. Katie took a hesitant step forward. I think it wants us to go inside," she said, her voice trembling. "Are you crazy?" Marcus snapped. "We don't even know what it is." Emily shook her head, her hands trembling. "We don't have a choice. There's nowhere else to go." Reluctantly, they moved toward the crumbling building, its once bright lights now flickering ominously. The door creaked open as they approached, as if inviting them in. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of decay and something metallic. The room was empty, save for a single table, and the highway stretched out endlessly before her, its once familiar markers erased. The road had become an alien thing, coiling into an unnatural horizon that didn't follow any logic she could understand. The clock on her dashboard still read 12:13, and the hum in the air was louder now, vibrating through her chest. Katie slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. She turned in her seat, forcing herself to look at them. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking. Emily blinked, just once, and when her eyes opened again, they weren't her eyes anymore. They were dark, empty voids, staring straight through Katie. Marcus followed, his head tilting unnaturally to one side, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a low, guttural sound filled the car, growing louder until it drowned out everything else. Katie covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it. Please, stop." The sound cut off abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. When she uncovered her ears, the car was empty. Marcus and Emily were gone. She turned back toward the road, her breathing ragged. She didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. But then she saw the figure in the distance. It was the man from before, the one with the hollow eyes. He stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlights, his posture calm, almost casual. Katie froze, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She knew running wasn't an option anymore. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped out. The air was cold, biting against her skin, but she forced herself to walk forward. Her legs felt heavy, like they were wading through water, but she kept going until she was only a few feet away from him. "What do you want from me?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost soothing. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's about what the road needs." Katie shook her head, her heart pounding. "I don't understand. Why me? Why us?" He gestured toward the endless stretch of highway behind her. "This road is more than pavement and lines. It's alive and it hungers. Every choice you made, the inside of the rest stop was the same as before, empty, decayed, and silent. The objects on the table were gone, replaced by a single notebook." Katie hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling as she flipped it open. The pages were filled with names, thousands of them, written in neat, identical handwriting. She flipped to the last page and saw her own name scrawled in fresh ink. Below it, 3 more names appeared: Marcus, Emily, and Ben. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She slammed the notebook shut, her breathing ragged. "This can't be it," she whispered. "This can't be how it ends." But when she turned to leave, the man was there again, blocking the door. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice calm. "The road always needs more." Katie woke up in her car, parked on the side of a quiet, empty highway. The sun was rising, casting a soft orange glow across the landscape. Her dashboard clock read 6:00 a.m. She blinked, disoriented, her mind racing to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? She looked down at her hands, still trembling, and noticed the notebook sitting on the passenger seat. Slowly, she reached for it, her heart pounding. The last page was blank. Her name, Marcus, Emily, and Ben, all of it was gone. Katie started the car and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before her, normal and mundane, just like any other morning commute. But as she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The whispers were gone, the shadows had faded, but the weight in her chest remained. She didn't know where Marcus, Emily, or Ben had gone, and she wasn't sure she ever would. But as she glanced at the notebook one last time, she noticed something she hadn't before, a faint outline of a number burned into the back cover.